Thank you all for coming. My name is Eric Lindquist. I'm one of the organizers of this series, Speaking of Books. Today's talk is the latest installment of this series, which has been going on since 2005. We started it because we thought there needed to be a forum on campus for all of the great books that were being written on campus that weren't necessarily didn't have a forum for necessarily. So we've had more than 30 of these events now, and we're going to, since there are a lot of good books continue to be published, we're going to continue doing this for the foreseeable future. So today's speaker is Emily Epstein Landau, who's a lecturer in the history department. She received her PhD from Yale University in 2005 and has been teaching at the University of Maryland since 2008. She specializes in the history of the American South and the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and has taught courses on the history of New Orleans and a course titled Race, Class, and Gender in the Formation of Modern America, 1877 to 1920. This semester she is teaching courses on the modern American South and the history of country music. Her book, Spectacular Wickedness, you've all seen this probably by now. We only had an online version of this, but for this event we actually purchased a real print copy to go for the library's collection, so this will be a permanent print copy. Spectacular Wickedness, Sex, Violence, and Memory in Storyville, New Orleans is based on her Yale dissertation and was published by Louisiana State Press in 2013. Debbie Applegate describes the book as, quote, exhaustively researched, elegantly argued, and vividly written, a wonderful work of history that will appeal to scholars, students, and the curious, not to mention open-minded general readers. Please join me in welcoming Emily Landau.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Eric, for having me. Very happy to be here and talk about my book, Spectacular Wickedness. This is a book about sex. Specifically, it is about sex in the most spectacular, notorious, shameful, flamboyant, and controversial commercial sex mart in American history. Storyville, the infamous New Orleans red light district. Storyville is probably most famous as a kind of incubator for jazz. It's known as the birthplace of jazz. My book isn't really about jazz. It's really more about sex. In 1897, the City Council of New Orleans passed an ordinance establishing a red light district, and Storyville was the result of their efforts. I didn't start out to write a book about Storyville. I didn't start out to write my dissertation about Storyville. I didn't know anything about New Orleans. I didn't know anything about prostitution. I didn't know anything about the South. I didn't know anything about jazz. I was taking a seminar in graduate school, and we were reading a lot about slavery and abolition. And I wanted to write about the relationship between sexual abuse and violence in slavery and prostitution outside of slavery. And I was intrigued by really one line in one book by Peter Kolchin about free women of color during the antebellum period working as prostitutes. And I thought, free women of color working as prostitutes, that's really fascinating, since within slavery, enslaved women of color were sexually abused, so regularly and systematically. The professor said, "Oh, Emily, you'll never find sources for a seminar-length paper. That would require too much research outside of the university." And he directed me to Storyville, which I had never heard of. But I started digging around, and as Eric said, I got my PhD at Yale, and Yale has a very good library. And one of the early things that I found was a guidebook. And at first I thought, oh, that's weird, a guidebook to a red light district. And it got weirder still, because within the guidebook there were not just advertisements, which you might expect from a guidebook, but there was a very particular rubric describing the women. W was for white women, C was for colored women. OCT was for octoroon women. And now this, I didn't know. If I had known more about the history of New Orleans, this term might not have stood out for me. It might not have taken me aback. I didn't really know what it meant. I knew that the rune might have something to do with, like, I'd heard of quadroons. I knew maroons were escaped slave communities. So I looked it up. It means, in the dictionary, it means 1/8 black. Okay, so Storyville opened in 1897, or it was created in 1897. I did know that there was a very important Supreme Court decision the year before, called Plessy v. Ferguson, from 1896, that had established a state's right to legislate segregation, separate but equal. I also knew that kind of the underlying discourse supporting segregation was to not just keep white people and black people away from each other, but kind of specifically to prevent interracial sex, that there was this big discourse against race mixing. And that supporting it was a kind of a violent culture of lynching. So I was puzzled. I thought, well, here's a red light district in 1897 advertising not just sex across the color line, but this kind of weird category, octoroon. Well, how is that even relevant? So I dug a little further and I learned that Homer Plessy was from New Orleans. Homer Plessy was an octoroon. Now this term, it really is a racist term, and I'm using it in the context of the history that used that term, because it's a kind of a blood calculus to determine status. Nevertheless, Albion Tourget, Homer Plessy's lawyer, made a very big deal about Homer Plessy being an octoroon, being so light-skinned that he didn't appear to be colored, and that was a major part of his argument. So I thought, here's this case. It turns out that it's a challenge to segregation law in New Orleans, and it's a challenge mounted by a very, very light-skinned man of color named Homer Plessy, who's called an octoroon. And their challenge is to, they want to obliterate the color line. They want to erase distinctions in society based on race, or to eliminate that particular binary as the organizing principle of American society, because it's unjust, and it becomes apparent how stupid it is when your plaintiff looks white. So this was all news to me. I didn't know anything about this. And I started to learn. Okay. I was nevertheless still puzzled. It didn't make sense that a red light district would be advertising sex with women who occupy this category that the Plessy v. Ferguson decision essentially had made moot, right? It had no meaning. You're black or you're white. This is the one-drop rule. So I started exploring more about what this term signified, octoroon, and I started learning that there is a large abolitionist literature from the antebellum period that focused on a character called the tragic octoroon, or the tragic mulatto, the tragic quadroon, but the tragic octoroon. And these were stories about the antebellum plantation that really focused on a very, very light-skinned young woman who, in the literature, is invariably too beautiful for words, and yet the authors take great pains to describe her beauty and her finely formed limbs and her elegant manners and her beautiful ankles and her white skin and her long black hair and her blue eyes. And she becomes a kind of sex object of abolitionism in this literature that's meant to arouse anger at the slave system. I mean, here she is. She's usually the daughter of the planter. She may or may not even know that she's, in fact, enslaved. the planter, her father, has always promised her freedom, but he dies without having signed the papers. She is sold into slavery. Most often in the literature, she's sold into what's called the fancy trade, which is a specific market in light-skinned, beautiful women slaves. And this is meant, obviously, to arouse anger at slavery. You know, slavery disrupts the family, it promotes licentiousness, it promotes absolute power and lust. And the octoroon, the tragic octoroon, is so much like a white woman, and she resembles white women of the middle and upper middle classes, that they can kind of, you know, identify with her and see in her plight something that could even maybe happen to them. Husbands aren't always faithful, marriages don't always work out, etc. So it becomes this very powerful tool to fight slavery. And there are a lot of poems, Longfellow's poem, The Quadroon Girl, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, something probably everyone is familiar with. Uncle Tom obviously is the more famous character, but she uses two different stories of octoroon or mixed race enslaved women to make her point about slavery disrupting the family and being horribly corrupting and awful and evil. And it turns out they're mother and daughter. But Dion Bosico wrote a play called The Octoroon, or Life in Louisiana. And Louisiana figures very prominently in these books because New Orleans was actually kind of the place best known for the fancy trade. So I'm educating myself about the octoroon. I learned about the fancy trade. I still thought it was kind of a paradox. I was feeling very stubborn. I didn't see how this could be, that this could make any sense. So, because the Supreme Court decision pretty much forbade, or at least, allowed states to pass a color line law. I didn't have that refined an idea of what that legislation meant, or I just knew that it was separate but equal, races were supposed to stay apart, interracial mingling, especially sex across the color line, was strictly forbidden. But Storyville was not only allowing it, but promoting it. Moreover, if the court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson obscured Plessy's ancestry and the history of the free people of color in Louisiana, which it did by labeling him colored and discounting his Creole of color heritage, Storyville brought that population stunningly back into view by way of its sexual specialty, the octoroon prostitute. So for nearly 20 years, Storyville flouted the segregationist order by aggressively advertising the availability of mixed-race women for the sexual pleasure of white men. Where Plessy v. Ferguson mandated racial separation, Storyville promoted interracial intimacy, as the district openly offered non-white prostitutes for its white customers. Scarcely a year after the Supreme Court denied Plessy his octoroon status and reclassified him as colored, his native city began showcasing octoroons. Storyville existed at the crossroads of the white middle class's desired binaries in sex and race, violating middle-class moral sensibilities and the dualistic imperatives of Jim Crow. This commercial sex district advertised interracial sex with octoroon prostitutes as a special attraction. How can this be? So I found kind of an answer in my to this paradox by exploring memory and the culture of memory, and by thinking about Storyville as a privileged space, a kind of liminal space that wasn't completely beholden to the prescriptions outside of it and transgressive. It's already a transgressive space because it's a red light district. So Storyville creates this privileged space that in a modern way is kind of reimagining and recapitulating the racial patriarchy of antebellum New Orleans By offering octoroons to white male customers, Storyville effectively democratized an exclusive privilege of the planter elite, the sexual possession of women of color, most particularly octoroons. The fancy trade, the tragic octoroon literature, other elements in New Orleans culture, these quadroon balls, all things that had been written about extensively in the antebellum period as a way of describing New Orleans as particularly exotic in a particularly erotic way. The things that visitors and travelers said about New Orleans weren't always true, but they created an image, an idea of the city that Storyville later drew on in its own advertising. So the book is about Storyville, the place, but it's also about the creation and elaboration of the octoroon fantasy inside Storyville and how people outside Storyville feel about it. People are always trying to get the district to shut down. They're trying to stop this, what they call a notorious attraction. They try to kind of humiliate the diamond queen of the demi-monde, Lulu White, who calls herself the world's handsomest octoroon. I also delve into the history of prostitution in New Orleans, which is a very, very long history. The history of sex in New Orleans, the literature of the tragic octoroon, this abolitionist trope that I've been describing, these travel accounts to antebellum New Orleans, and even a brief history of the Creoles of color and their tradition of civil rights engagement. That's somewhat anachronistic, but this group in New Orleans was keenly aware of a discourse of universal human rights, and they fought to maintain their rights, and then after the Civil War, they fought for all people of color to have civil rights, equal rights. Citizenship is national and knows no color, which led to the Plessy case. So I thought I would read a little bit about the place, some descriptions, and then I will take some questions. On April 9th, 1908, Newton C. Wood stopped in New Orleans on his way to Texas from his home in Alabama. From Union Station on South Rampart Street, he made his way to Storyville. He went to a brothel where he drank a few beers and had sex with one or several of the women. Afterward, with his pants hanging on a chair near the bed, he fell asleep. When he woke up, it's very, very good timing, Penelope. When he woke up a little later, he got dressed and walked back to the train station. There he discovered that his wallet, containing $70 and his train ticket, was missing. Unable to board the train and desirous of justice, he wandered around until the next morning when he found a police officer and brought him to the house to arrest the 3 women who lived there. 2 days later, there was a trial. The prostitute's defense attorney asked Woods what he was doing at the brothel. He replied, "Frolicking around." The attorney continued, "You were having fun? You were frolicking around with these Negro women?" For Woods was white, and the women were black. Woods replied, "Yes, sir, I suppose so." By 1908, the time that this trial happened, Storyville was already extremely famous. It enjoyed a kind of tremendous infamy and notoriety as a kind of a mecca for, transgressive sex. And one of the benefits of, it was a fully formed entertainment district. Right? It had tremendous music. You could get food, but I wouldn't have eaten there, I don't think. There's great, but it's a sex mart, and with a lot of music. And one of the benefits of the interest in jazz is that people recorded a lot of interviews with jazz musicians who had played in Storyville, and those became very wonderful sources for me in learning what the district was like. You may be familiar with the song Basin Street Blues. It was written by the nephew of New Orleans' most prominent madam, Lulu White. It was written by Spencer Williams. The song Basin Street Blues was published in the 1920s after Storyville had been shut down by the government and offered a kind of memorial to it. According to the lyrics, New Orleans was the land of dreams, nothing less than heaven on earth, and Basin Street was the very place to lose one's Basin Street blues. Much later, and in a quite different context, Williams remembered Basin Street as a street of pleasure with its, quote, dance halls, honky-tonks, and cabarets, and its bordellos. The Basin Street bordellos, many of which resembled mansions, could be seen from the street, and aerial views of 20th century New Orleans show the cupolas of Josie Arlington's and Lulu White's bordellos towering above the mansard roofs of surrounding houses. Indeed, Lulu White's Mahogany Hall could be seen from Canal Street all the way to Esplanade. Basin Street itself was especially broad and had once housed a canal and 2 sets of train tracks. Only one side of the street was dedicated to bordellos, so it clearly demarcated the district and acted as a kind of entryway. One passed through Basin Street and into a different world, this demi-monde. The district, if I had any images, it would be a map showing where it was, but the district was created as a reform measure to actually curtail and limit prostitution, but they put it right outside the French Quarter and right next to the New American section. So it's really kind of bridges the old city and the new developing city. It was very, very easy to access. I'm just going to read some of the musicians' recollections. Jelly Roll Morton, for instance, recalled the mansions, quote, the mansions where everything was of the highest class. These houses were filled up with the most expensive furniture and paintings, end quote. The grand bordellos of Basin Street, remembered another pioneer of jazz music, were just like millionaires' houses. Manuel Mineta, a jazz pianist, remembered Lulu White's Mahogany Hall as plush, with 2 separate parlors, each with its own piano. Those Sporton houses, remembered Morton, had the most beautiful parlors with cut glass and draperies and rugs and expensive furniture. Some of them had mirror parlors where you couldn't find the door for the mirrors, the one at Lulu White's costing $30,000. Upstairs at White's, Clarence Williams, the musician, bandleader, and producer, said, quote, mirrors stood at the foot and the head of all the beds. For those who are overawed and too scared to go in, there were smaller brothels and even cribs, one-room shacks where prostitutes worked without the accoutrements of high-class bordellos. Yet Williams recalled once in a while even a sailor might patronize the luxurious bordellos. Overall, the district was a mecca for romantic playboys and big-shot financiers. They found the district irresistible. Musicians remembered that the high-class bordellos were for rich people, big-timers who paid $1 for a beer or $25 for a bottle of champagne. But as Newton Wood's experience tells us, not all of the houses were like millionaires' houses, and not all of the men went to experience this elegant, high-class pleasure. Within the district, there was great variety. Jelly Roll Morton remembered they had everything in the district from the highest class to the lowest. Creep joints where they'd put the feelers on a guy's clothes. Cribs that rented for about $5 a day and had just about enough room for a bed. Small-time houses where the price was from 50 cents to $1, and they put on the naked dances, circuses, and jive. For sailors, docked in New Orleans, the district was very often their first stop. That doesn't make New Orleans very unusual, I guess. Two such sailors from a fruit steamer lost or were robbed of their money in Storyville. One $5, the other $10. They only noticed they were missing the money after they had left the brothel they had visited and had gone to get a beer. Another man, Presiliano Morena, lost significantly more money, $90 in Storyville, as he recounted his experience. There were 3 women in the house, 2 Negroes and a white woman, and I went to bed with the white woman. And then he added, anyway, she looked like she was white. While he was having sex with her, the other ones went through his pockets. And while many instances of robbery appear to have taken place while the customer's pants hung on a chair near the bed while he slept, or even during sex, this robbery seems to have been especially bold. Moreno saw them do it. He was looking at them. He was, however, in no position to make them stop. So here we have this district. It has these very, very high-class houses, so to speak, and these very low creep joints. What made it really kind of spectacular was that because it had this special legal dispensation, it produced these guidebooks and it had these ads. It became a tourist attraction, and it had guidebooks. It's not, okay. And I'm just going to read you the introduction to one of these wonderful blue books. They have this tone that is just, if you can have the tone of a wink and a nod, that's what the tone is. Introduction, and it says, introduction. How to be wise. A man who wants to be a thoroughbred rounder these days has to carry a certain amount of hot air and be a wise guy, no matter how painful. Now, if you're in the ABC class, you want to get a move on yourself in 23, and to do it proper is to read what this little booklet has to say. And if you don't get to be a 2-to-1 shot, it ain't the author's fault. There's more than one way to spend your coin besides going against race games, and if you pay particular attention to this guide, you will never be led astray by touts or gold brick advisors. The contents of this book are the facts, and not dreams from a hop joint. You will now find the boundary of the Tenderloin District, commonly known as Anderson County or Storyville, North Side Custom House Street to South Side St. Louis, East Side North Basin to West Side North Robertson. This is the boundary in which the lewd women are compelled to live according to law. This book not mailable. So Storyville produced these guidebooks, and they're full of ads. Basically what would happen is you get off the train and some kind of little messenger boy would hand you a very small book called The Keyhole or The Lid. And you, if you were interested, he would direct you to where you could buy the more expensive blue book. Each guide begins with an introduction, combining innuendo and incomprehensible slang with the kind of useful information any tourist would desire, including a key to reading the guide. Names and capitals are landladies. W stands for white, C for color, and OCT for octoroon. After 1910, interestingly, the guides changed their rubric from their geographical orientation to an alphabetical order, with the various races of the prostitutes still accentuated. Quote, the directory will be found alphabetically under the heading white and colored from alpha to omega, and they still maintained a separate section for octoroons. This figurative segregation only highlighted the availability of interracial sex in the district, making seeking it more convenient. Part of the books also explained the reason for Storyville. Why New Orleans should have this directory, one book explained. First, because it is the only district of its kind in the state set aside for the fast women by law. Second, because it puts the stranger on a proper grade or path as to where to go and be secure from holdups, race games, or other illegal practices usually worked on the unwise in the red light districts. The ads focus on the material culture of Storyville, the things in the houses, the Turkish parlor, the wonderful rugs, the draperies, the oil paintings, all the things that signify bourgeois aspiration or ascension up that class ladder. Miss Josie Arlington, 225 North Basin Street. No pen can describe the beauty and magnificence of her house. The draperies, carved furniture, and oil paintings are of foreign make, and a visit will teach more than man can tell. I mean, it's very... Lulu White, when her Mahogany Hall opened, she came out with a souvenir guide describing the district, describing her bordello. But oftentimes customers brought home a different kind of souvenir, a sexually transmitted disease. And the Blue Books also had an answer for this. There were advertisements. When troubled with a leak, use the famous number 7 specifics. A marvelous success with gonorrhea and gleep. Cures in 3 days. When worried with crawlers, try a bottle of anti-crab lotion. It kills. J.A. Legendre, 2 stores, etc., etc. Sometimes one blue book featured 3 or 4 ads for cures like the above number 7 or Otto Hellman's number 206 mixture. A sure cure in a short time, prepared only by Otto Hellman. Remember, you won't be away from your girl long if you use number 206. Other merchants also advertised in the blue books. Mostly they were ads for liquor distributors, but every once in a while you would get a different kind of merchant. A.E. Ravine, funeral director and embalmer, fine funeral furnishings. So it's a really interesting guidebook. And it mixes this kind of high and low at the same time, always claiming this incredible high-class status, simultaneously knowing that it's absurd in the setting in which it's advertising it. I just want to talk a little teeny bit about Lulu White. She was Storyville's most notorious madam. She called herself the Diamond Queen of the Demi-Monde, and she crafted this persona for herself as an octoroon. And she became really the most famous madam in Storyville. And she was a very powerful person in New Orleans. She was very close, it seems, with the man who became the chief of police. And she was always having scrapes with the law, but she never seemed to have to pay any penalties. And she created this this guidebook, this souvenir booklet to describe Mahogany Hall. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from Mahogany Hall. She spoke early on in her career through a souvenir booklet she released to describe her brothel. The new Mahogany Hall, it boasted, was built of marble and is 4-story, containing 5 parlors, all handsomely furnished, and 15 bedrooms. Each room has a bath with hot and cold water and extension closets. The elevator, which was built for 2, is of the latest style. The entire house is steam heated and is the handsomest house of its kind. So this is 1898, where much of the South doesn't have indoor plumbing or running water, an elevator, my God. So it really is quite luxurious. The cost of the building, like everything else Lulu White said, was subject to change. Here it was said to cost $40,000. Later she claimed it cost $25,000, $50,000, etc. She introduced herself to the reader of her brochure. In presenting this souvenir to my multitude of friends, she began, it is my earnest desire to, in the first place, avoid any and all egotism, and secondly, to impress them with the fact that the cause of my success must certainly be attributed to their hearty and generous support of my exertions in making their visits to my establishments a moment of pleasure. Another section ends by calling Mahogany Hall the place where you can get 3 shots for your money. The shot upstairs, the shot downstairs, and the shot in the room. She calls herself, she says that she's from the West Indies. She says, Lulu White identifies herself, writing in the third person, Lulu White here identified herself as West Indian, age 31. So arriving in this country at a rather tender age and having been fortunately gifted with a good education, it did not take long for her to find out what the other sex were in search of. So she's constantly playing on this idea of kind of bourgeois status and respectability, education, fine arts, a study of literature, but then sliding in with and I know what men want, and it's really all about the sex. So she's actually a very interesting character, not from New Orleans, not from the West Indies, actually from Alabama, and so her self-fashioning is almost like a metaphor for the way Storyville fashioned itself and created and elaborated this octoroon fantasy. And Storyville became this place where Lulu White could really act out this persona that she had invented for herself and make a lot of money. Things didn't end that well for Lulu White, but I won't spoil it. So I'd be really happy to answer any questions that anyone might have about the research or the topic.
Were there competing guidebooks?
For the Storyville? No, there was just one series, and they were published probably by the assistant to this man, Thomas Anderson, who was a big property owner in the district and also a Louisiana state senator. So Anderson Country, when the guidebook says formerly Anderson Country, they're referring to Tom Anderson and his kind of ownership, let's say, of the sex market in New Orleans.
I'm just curious, I know that there were numerous attempts to close the district during its life, and ultimately it was the U.S. Department of War that had to come in and close it down to
Yes.
protect the sailors and soldiers from BD. How long do you think, if that hadn't been the case? I mean, it just seemed that the reformers were trying to do it, and the Mayor Behrman was, you know, a machine politician. He and Anderson were hand in hand, and I mean, do you think it would have gone on much longer after 1917?
Well, it's not like prostitution ended. Right. So, as Mayor Berman said, you can make it illegal, but you can't make it unpopular. So the soldiers and sailors were coming in, and this man who was really trying to get the district closed actually sent a letter to Josephus Daniel saying that Mayor Berman loves his naval station and he would be devastated to lose it. And Josephus Daniels came in and gave him the choice, Storyville Naval Station, and he went with the naval station. So I mean, prostitution continued. There are these wonderful investigations that, I mean, they seem kind of comic to read about them, where the special agents are trying to determine if prostitution is still taking place, and they're counting the number of soldiers and sailors that they find in bordellos. There's an elaborate scheme that is concocted where taxi drivers drive soldiers or sailors to a hotel and rent them civilian clothing that they can wear so that they're not caught as military people. So I think that, I think there probably might even still be prostitution in New Orleans. I think what happens after they loses its special status is that people like Lulu White cease to be protected by the police, and it becomes seedier and seedier and seedier as people like her, they either leave or they lose their protection and lose their money. So I think that, prostitution, also kind of the culture of prostitution and of red light districts really changed with this massive reform campaign to end prostitution. And it went along with changes in courtship rituals and gender norms, but this idea that red light districts were okay because prostitution was a necessary evil and a good place for men to get their energies out while protecting women, that ceased to be really in vogue, and the notion of kind of abstinence for the man and the woman took over. People signed pledges that they would live the white life, which has a very racial connotation as well, but this idea of kind of the ascendant bourgeois morality was that prostitution was bad and not an appropriate release.
Can you talk about what the language difference? What did madams call themselves besides Madam Amy? And what did the officials, the newspapers, the public call the madams? Do you know what I'm saying? There's a litany of names, but how those differ. Can you rattle some off?
Well, Lulu White is actually a really perfect example, because in the district she's the Diamond Queen, the country's handsomest octoroon. She, the proprietress of this Grand Bordello. Outside of the district, she is the most notorious negress. She's a Negro prostitute. She's a, Negro this and Negro that. And it's all about the fact that she is not white, that she is a Negro, and that she's a low character and a disorderly character, and not, in fact, a respectable middle-class property owner as she presents herself in the guidebooks and in her public persona. The public officials who are trying to kind of out her, I guess, are extremely derisive and derogatory toward her and toward the other women in Storyville, and they're extraordinarily racist as well, not just about the women in Storyville, but about the jazz musicians. Is that kind of what you meant, or did you mean?
I mean, and also, like, were the same epithets applied to white women who ran houses like that as well? I mean, what was their racial difference as well?
They would. There was no sense that when these women left Storyville that they were in any way respectable women, unless they chose not to show themselves as Josie Arlington when they left Storyville. You know, I mean, you can't tell who's a prostitute if they're not acting like a prostitute in a bordello, right? So women could actually, get along very nicely in respectable society if they chose to. It just would mean not publicly announcing that they were prostitutes everywhere they went.
I've got two questions. One is lighter than the other. The light one is, do you know the movie Band of Angels with Clark Gable? Made in 1959, set in antebellum New Orleans with Yvonne DiCarlo as the tragic octoroon, complete with the entire story. She's brought up by her father and thinks that she's free, that her mother has somehow disappeared, and he dies. And
How could I not know this movie?
and Gable is playing Rhett Butler, except it's 20 years later. But it's the same character. It's something you should really see. There's a famous scene where they arrive at his plantation, which is one of the most outrageous racist scenes made in the 50s.
Wow.
Fred Zinnemann, I think, is the director. And but that means that fantasy retained its power 100 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that's something to take a look at, because why would they make a movie about the tragic octoroon?
Right. Band of Angels.
Sidney Poitier is in there also.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the kind of modern culture thing to think about, how long-term this fantasy is. The other fantasy that I want to say is the guys who go to these mansions, are they actually, the fantasy they're being sold is not just sex, it's wealth. And it's not just wealth, it's antebellum wealth. It's they can play at being planters, right? So are the people who go, do you know anything about the clientele? Are they actually bourgeois guys, workaday guys, office guys, or maybe better than office guys, lawyers or something like that, who can't play?
They're all lawyers.
That wouldn't surprise me. They're going from one whorehouse to the next. That wouldn't surprise me. That is that the fantasy that's being sold to them, because why have these splendid palaces? It's one thing to have a house that's okay, that's not crawling with bugs or something like that. But why create the fantasy of the antebellum mansion and sell that as the place where you can have sex?
That is an excellent question. And Storyville, in its advertisements and its kind of self-presentation, is really playing two sides. The octoroon fantasy is an elaboration of patriarchal privilege. But along with that is the flattery of the commercial classes and the new bourgeoisie. This is something that the South is trying to emerge from the Civil War as an economic contender. And one of the motivations, actually, of the progressive reformers who create Storyville is to clear the city for respectable business enterprise and attract tourists. So the creation to attract tourists and to attract northern capital. And so Storyville becomes a kind of an emblem of their efforts in that it allows them to disavow prostitution in their city, at the same time winkingly saying, but just a block off the French Quarter and 2 blocks from the train station is this bordello. So there are multiple kind of overlapping and even sometimes contradicting fantasies taking place in Storyville all at the same time, and it's kind of over-determined in a sense. So that everything there is designed to, in a sense, empower the men. And the racial organization, to me, was the most stark element of it. But it also has this very, this emphasis on the draperies, on oil paintings, on the commercial classes. There are some of the ads in the Blue Book of white women, white proprietresses saying, Gypsy Schaefer stands in good stead with all the commercial classes of the city. Come visit your house, and everyone is treated equal at Gypsy Schaefer's. And just even her name kind of gives it away that's absurd. It's an absurd thing to say. So there are all of these different things kind of at play at once. And so Storyville is simultaneously kind of constructing a racial order, even as it's flattering and pushing the new class order, the new economic order. It's in its inclusion of all white men into this octoroon fantasy. That's the rhetoric of it, just like the rhetoric of white supremacy as a rhetoric of democratizing privilege. But in reality, it's really quite exclusive. The fancy houses, the mansions and palaces are too expensive for most people to be able to go to. So there's a kind of a class exclusivity there.
I have a couple of questions. Is there any connection between this idea of the octoroon and the Circassian beauties that used to be in the United States in the 19th century? And then the second question, which is, I guess, separate, is what were the economics of it? In other words, who was profiting here?
Okay, so the Circassian, those are like the kind of captivity narratives, right? The Orientalist captivity narratives, right? So there's a kind of that is not unrelated to the kind of prurient tragic octoroon literature. You see it even in Indian captivity narratives, Native American captivity narratives, the searchers. The idea of a beautiful white-looking woman being held captive as a sex slave is a kind of trope in Western culture that is not limited to the tragic octoroon. The economics are, they're complicated because nobody kept any books, but people, when Lulu White died poor, there was she didn't leave any money. She had to sell Mahogany Hall, etc. But Willie Piazza, her fellow octoroon madam, she retired. She moved to the suburbs. She bought a yacht. There's a great range. So a lot of the times, the women who were the proprietresses of their own bordellos did in fact make a lot of money. Josie Arlington, when she died, there was a huge dispute over her will because she had left so much property, and there was this question of should it go to her husband, but he was now married to her niece. It was all very complicated, but there was a lot of money involved. There was something in the district called the Pimps Club or the Pimp Syndicate. It called itself the Pimps Club. That was organized to take money from the women and give money to the cops. So there's a system of kind of bribes and kickbacks that goes pretty high up, I'm assuming, but I don't have any receipts. When Lulu White bought Mahogany Hall the district is created by ordinance in 1897, and she, like a few months later, she's already secured a prime location in the district. She raises the small Creole cottage that's there and builds this amazing 4-story marble mansion with 15 rooms and 5 parlors, and all the walls are made out of mirrors, etc. In order to do that, she buys the lot of ground for not very much money, and this man, George Washington Flynn, notarizes the deal. Now, Flynn is the assistant city attorney and a notary public, so he notarizes the deal for her, then he buys the property from her and sells it back to her. He arranges like a mortgage for her over 4.5 years, providing her with the funds to build Mahogany Hall. And he appears other times as well as her lawyer, as a lawyer, or as notarizing deals and representing other prostitutes in New Orleans. So it's very interesting network. It's a lot of corruption in New Orleans.
To what extent, what was the relationship of the different brothels to each other? To what extent did they work together to kind of maintain their power, and to what extent did they compete with each other?
That's another really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. People like Lulu White made strategic alliances that weren't necessarily with other prostitutes or madams or women of color. She testified for the police in an incident where they had poisoned women in Willie Piazza's house. But when the city passed an ordinance segregating the red light district and threatening to make all women of color leave the area that was Storyville, at least 25 different women of color filed petitions, and they were all represented by George Washington Flynn and this other lawyer who had represented Lulu White in an earlier case. So I think that the nature of alliances was totally strategic and dependent on the circumstances. I haven't found anything like a kind of ethos of sisterhood among these women, and I don't see any kind of proto-feminism or anything that would suggest kind of higher consciousness or social justice. So I think that they probably were, and this really is probably, were maintaining networks to keep themselves safe from certain kinds of criminal prosecutions, but we're not above, going after themselves when necessary.
Related to that, is there any evidence that the prostitutes moved from brothel to brothel and kind of?
Yeah, they did. The ones you could work in a kind of a high-class bordello, or you could work in a crib. I mean, the women who worked in the cribs, it would they rented out those spaces and would work different shifts during the day or during the night, and there were different grades of houses, and people. I mean, it wasn't just men who knew about Storyville. Women knew about Storyville, and they went to New Orleans to work in that red light district because they could make more money there, or establish connections. There's one woman who had worked for Lulu White in Mahogany Hall, who later had her own bordello, and so there was a certain kind of social mobility. Women moved around a lot, and people also, they sometimes they maybe were associated with the bordello, but they lived in a different part of town,
That was part of my question. So did the women live, was Storyville residential at all, or was it solely just for?
I think it's a really good question. So for some of the women, they would stay there for a while, and they would live in Mahogany Hall and sleep there. But I think for other places, this was their place where they worked, and they would come and work there. And there were other businesses in Storyville. There's, a Chinese laundry. There are different restaurants. There even were some people who lived there who didn't have anything to do with the sex trade. So it was a very kind of fluid place, and what makes it seem less fluid is these advertisements that are always talking about it as a thing and as a place. It didn't actually contain prostitution either. Prostitutes continued to work all over New Orleans. What it did was create a very visible and easy to find location for going to see a prostitute, but there was still prostitution elsewhere in the city. So there, in this case, in 1917, when the district tried to segregate, when the city tried to segregate the district, they actually stumbled, and the madams won their first round of appeals because they said you can't discriminate against us along the lines of residents, of we're colored prostitutes, and you can't discriminate against us as colored prostitutes living here. And they made this argument that that we live here or we live somewhere else, and it's a work site and it's a residence, and it was a very kind of confusing place, but they definitely sometimes would live other places. I realize that wasn't a very clear answer, but it was a very complicated case, so sorry. Yes.
Are those houses still there in the residential?
They're all gone.
Oh, no.
In 1930, there's one structure that remains. In 1939, Louisiana got New Deal funding to build housing, and they completely razed the district, and they built a kind of white public housing project, and that housing project then became really kind of a black public housing project called the Iberville Houses. And after Katrina, even though they weren't damaged at all, the city decided to tear those down. So what's really interesting, what's happening now is that because those have been torn down, they're actually doing archaeological work in the Storyville site and trying to locate artifacts. So that's, there's something good that comes out of it. That's it.
Shall we go ahead and thank?
Thank you.